Everybody has been warning me that it gets a little scary out here, but it's lovely to be here today. I'm actually, as Olivia just mentioned, I'm of Turkish origin. I have lived in the US, and now I live in the UK in London. And I seem to spend most of my time on planes. I think this is the way most of us feel like, actually. There was this famous movie, Up in the Air, and so many of us actually ended up relating to that movie. And I was checking the numbers, and apparently, I don't know if you knew this, but every second now, there are 500,000 people in the air. So that tells you how the world has changed, and it's changing, basically. And that brings me to my first question. I actually would love to find out what you think is the number of nationalities that are present here. Obviously, me as a Turk perhaps adds one additional layer to that diversity, but if I had been given this speech 40 years ago, first of all, most probably a woman would not be giving the speech. And secondly, I think it would be a very different audience out here, very, very different. And I understand that there are 120 different nationalities at St. Andrews, just in the undergraduate department. It's pretty amazing. When I studied in the US, being Turkish was still quite exotic, and I enjoyed that. Everybody used to say how exotic it was. Well, with obviously technology, nothing remains so exotic anymore. But I really would love to talk to you about national and versus global economy and the power of corporations within this whole economy. And this is something that either we demonize and we say corporations are doing everything so terrible to harm us, or we tend to oscillate to the other side of the spectrum, saying that corporations are just amazing and everything is going to be better by our freedom of choice as the consumer. And I'm going to actually argue that it's neither of those. I believe this is my personal view. Let's see what you think about it. So my second question to you is, what do you think, can you name two of the main largest companies in the world? More? Apple. Kraft. Google. Well, I used to work for Royal Dutch Shell, but unfortunately, it's actually not there. Oh, this is the economies. I was trying to, yes, pardon me. I pressed this prematurely. But as you see, it's Apple, ExxonMobil, Google, Microsoft, and Berkshire Hathaway. And when we think about, so actually people guessed two of those out of the five, so well done. Which are the largest economies by size in terms of nation states? So it's the United States, China, Japan, Germany, and France currently. But when we look at what's going to happen by 2050, because this is what we're here to talk about, right? Well, Mr. Korn talked about the past and its relevance to the present. And what I'd love to talk about is how we're going to see a change in the way the world is working so we can actually get ready for that change. Because if we cannot expect what's going to be happening by 2050, then we're not going to be ready with the things that we can do to influence that change. And as you see, it's actually the largest economies are going to be shifting towards the east, and this is a phenomenon we've all been talking about. I'm sure you debate this here as well. And that phenomena is going to mean that a lot of the corporations that we saw in the previous slide, their consumer base is going to be shifting east as well. So that's a major shift in our thinking. And I'm not even going to try to guess which companies are going to be the top 5 largest companies in 40 years' time, because I could have certainly never guessed it would have been Apple and Google in that list 40 years ago. So things are changing so rapidly, so quickly, that it's very difficult to predict that. But one of the things that we can say is a lot of the corporations say that they don't necessarily have power, but corporations have money, and we tend to associate money with power. And one of the best ways of actually utilizing power is to say that we don't have it. And I'm here going to assume that actually corporations do have power, but what does that power come from? And it actually does come from perception of what, and the ability to influence. It's not only about money, but it's about how we can actually use that perception for the better good of humanity, actually. And when you look at the top 5 countries in terms of its global perception, it's actually not the same as in the previous slide in terms of its size. So it's Germany, the United States, United Kingdom, France, and Canada. I wonder if we're going to see a huge shift in this list in 40 years' time. What would you say? Do you think it's going to change? Are we going to see China as one of the highest perception holders? No? Nobody's saying anything. But out of the top 5 companies in terms of perception, again, there's a different list. Some of them do coincide. Apple, Google, Amazon, Starbucks, and Walt Disney. And estimated size of the global economy. Again, I think I pressed the same. Now, we have 2 different types of power. One of them is the national power. The other one is the corporate power. Actually, out of the 175 economic entities currently, guess how many of them are made up of corporations? I'm talking about nation states and just the size of entities. 111 are corporations out of the 175. That's actually a huge number. So we're now governed equally by corporations as well as nations. And this is something that we need to get our heads around, because actually the current world order was based on a couple of revolutions. Obviously, it's coming from a very long past. And one of the things that changed us was it was the commercial revolution that later on moved into the industrial revolution. And that industrial revolution now, coupled with technology and everything moving at such a rapid pace, is now changing how we interact with each other. And we now see all these corporations that straddle across the globe, that have influence and stakeholders across the globe. And but with institutions, actually global institutions like the World Trade Organization and different other ones, that don't necessarily account for this change. So we really need to start thinking about how we're going to bring this change into reality, because we tend to be, as global citizens, if we're calling ourselves global citizens, we tend to be a little bit behind the way we've revolutionized our institutions. And what do governments stand for? Who are the beneficiaries of the governments? We tend to think that it's actually we, the people. So the government is here to better our lives as people. But what do corporations stand for? Who are their beneficiaries? I guess you can hazard a guess. Well, it's actually to create value for the stakeholders, for their shareholders. This is what they need to do. And you see what I'm trying to get at. So you have 2 different power sets here. One of them is actually about we the people. The other one is about individual, not individual, but shareholder rights and their benefits. And how are we going to find a way of bringing these 2 together to make sure that in a global economy, we actually create a global society? I think this is something really, really important. The phrase globalization has become, one of the buzzwords of the century. We all talk about globalization. I personally perhaps am an example of globalization as somebody who grew up in a Muslim country, who lived in and studied in the US, who now is privileged to be talking to you here now. And being able to work actually at a global company doing global deals. I don't work only in one country. And my work spans the entirety of the world. But I'm also trying to understand how we can actually help influence as consumers and as individuals, how we can influence governments and the current institutions that we have to include this new reality into the world stage. And perhaps I don't have a solution. I don't know if anybody has a solution, but do we include some of the CEOs of the larger corporations at some of the larger worldwide international meetings at the UN Security Council, for example. This is a crazy idea, yes, but we've never thought about it. And corporations don't tend to, in our minds at least, don't tend to have the same transparency as we would expect from a government. We don't know who they really report to, especially if it's not open to the public. Obviously, the large ones are listed on the stock exchanges, which makes it a little bit more accessible to us. Yet, you don't really know exactly how the decision-maker structure works and whether or not we get to say, as the people, we the people, get to say anything about it. And a lot of the corporations obviously argue that it's because we as the consumer have the right to choose which corporation we're going to work with, that we're going to make the wise decision of choosing the one that we would prefer and the one that would be benefiting us. But it's not always the case. It cannot be. And corporations obviously straddle across the globe. And I do think that Google is a prime example of this. I'm sure you followed what's happening in Europe and the anti-competition case against Google. But Google serves as a way of accessing information for a lot of us. And the way it's revolutionized the way we think is also quite important. But Starbucks, this is actually a sign of Starbucks in Saudi Arabia. And you see these large multinational companies all around the world creating this unity, at least. As a consumer, we feel closer to one another just because we happen to be drinking the same coffee from Starbucks. 40 years ago, none of us would be able to do the same thing in at least 100 different countries all at the same time. And this brings us together, similar experiences. Facebook in Africa. Africa, please don't get me wrong, I'm not going to even argue that Africa is one continent, but it was just to bring you an idea of what Africa and what Facebook has done in Africa. Actually, 100 million people in Africa use Facebook. It's unbelievable. When you think about the fact that 358 million people in Africa don't have access to clean water. And what does Facebook and similar companies try to do in Africa? They actually try to increase our ability, the people's ability to access data and to access communications methods in Africa, which in turn, hopefully, we would assume will actually help our ability to access water as well. So it's another company, Uber. I'm sure, I don't know how many of you use it. I find it quite helpful, actually. But Uber is a technology platform. As you know, it matches drivers with its riders. And it's just a technology platform. It's one of those disruptive businesses. We have a similar one like Airbnb. It's all about experiences. We now, we don't want to necessarily own places everywhere. We actually are really happy to be traveling and to be going to different locations. And when we actually travel with these companies, using these tools, we tend to experience other people's lives. Again, another layer of globalization, how these companies are actually helping us think about the world as citizens of the world in a different way. And Uber has done the same. The taxi industry is one of the most difficult ones to penetrate. It has the highest levels of regulations. And just by offering a technology platform, Uber has actually opened up the drivers to the riders, making it easier for everyone to go from point A to point B. And Google's global growth. Remember that one of the first slides that I showed about where the center of gravity in terms of economic growth is shifting? It's actually shifting towards the east. And that means that a lot of these companies need to now start, and they already are existent in countries like China, India, Indonesia, Russia. Actually, all of these companies are going to these countries. And while they go into these countries, they need to adapt as well. As the countries are trying to adapt, as the regulators in those countries are trying to adapt, the companies, the corporations are trying to adapt as well. And the executive chairman of Google then actually said that he thought it would be arrogant for them to walk into a country where they're just beginning operations and to tell the country how to run itself. But ultimately, by being there and by providing some of these services that they provide, they are telling the people of those countries how they should be running them. So I'd like to thank you very much for your time today. And I do hope that we manage to, all together, collectively actually, think about how we can translate global economy into a global society for all of us to benefit from. Thank you.